The chandelier light caught the crystal glasses just right, scattering tiny rainbows across the faces of Seoul's wealthiest citizens. A string quartet played something soft and European in the corner. Women in floor-length gowns laughed at things that weren't funny. Men in tailored suits shook hands they'd rather not shake. It was the kind of evening where everything was beautiful and nothing was real. Park Ji-hoon stood at the top of the marble staircase, surveying the gala like a general reviewing a battlefield. His tuxedo was Italian, his posture impenetrable, his expression carved from something colder than stone. At 36, he had become the kind of man that rooms went quiet for. The chairman of Park Star Group. The man who turned his father's struggling construction firm into a conglomerate spanning 12 countries. Forbes had called him relentless. His rivals called him worse things. He raised his glass to his lips, and that was when he saw her. She was moving through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, navigating between guests with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Her dark hair was pulled back. Her uniform was standard. She was not supposed to be someone who stopped time. But Ji-hoon's hand froze mid-air. The glass never reached his mouth. Every sound in the room seemed to fall away. The quartet. The laughter. The clinking of crystal. All of it just, gone. Because he knew those eyes. He had spent 7 years trying to forget them. Mr. Park. His assistant touched his elbow. Sir, the director of the foundation is waiting for your remarks. Ji-hoon didn't move. 30 feet away, a small girl, no older than 6, tugged at the woman's uniform hem. She looked down quickly, shaking her head, whispering something urgent. But the girl was already staring back toward the staircase with wide, curious eyes. She pointed. Mommy, her voice carried in a brief gap between musical phrases, clear as a bell, why does that man keep looking at you? Several heads turned. A diplomat's wife leaned toward her husband. A business journalist reached for her phone. The woman looked up then. And for one devastating second, her eyes met Ji-hoon's from across the glittering room. She went pale as paper. And Park Ji-hoon, the man who had stared down boardrooms and bankrupted competitors without blinking, felt something crack open in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in 7 years. Her name was Han Imani, and she had grown up in a world that had nothing to do with chandeliers. She'd been raised in a 3-room apartment in Mapogu, the kind of neighborhood where the walls were thin and the neighbors argued and the smell of someone else's dinner was always drifting through the vents. Her mother had worked 2 jobs. Her father had left when she was 9. She had learned young that the world did not hand you things, that you had to be smarter, faster, quieter, and you had to need less than everyone around you just to stay afloat. She was 24 when she met Park Ji-hoon. He had just taken over as acting chairman after his father's stroke. He was not yet the polished, impenetrable figure he would become. Back then, he was still a man with rough edges, brilliant and driven and achingly human. They'd met at a company volunteer event, the kind of obligatory community outreach that neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. She was there through a non-profit she worked for. He was there because his PR team had insisted. He had spilled coffee on her shoes. Not metaphorically, literally. A full cup, scalding, right across her white sneakers. "I'll buy you new ones," he'd said, horrified. "Don't bother," she'd replied. They were on sale. He'd laughed. Really laughed, the kind that surprised him, like it had escaped before he could stop it. His PR manager later told him it was the first time she'd seen him laugh like that in 2 years. They didn't start as anything grand. He kept finding reasons to run into her. She kept pretending she didn't notice. But there was something between them that neither of them could explain away, a recognition, like 2 people who had been reading the same book from different ends and finally met somewhere in the middle. Within 6 months, she was the only person in his life who spoke to him without calculating what they might get in return. She asked him questions that had nothing to do with business. She argued with him. She fell asleep reading on his couch. She made him feel, for the first time in years, like a man rather than a machine. He told her once, late at night on the rooftop of his apartment, "I don't know what I'm doing with you." She'd looked at the Han River glimmering below and said, "You're being a person, Ji-hoon. It's okay. It won't kill you." He had believed her. He should have known that happiness in his world always came with a price tag. It began with a phone call she wasn't supposed to overhear. She had arrived early at his penthouse, she had a key by then, and the door between the study and the hallway was open just a crack. She hadn't meant to listen. She had meant to set down the takeout she'd brought and wait. But the words stopped her cold. "The Lee family knows about her." The voice on the phone was Ji-hoon's chief strategist, a man named Oh Byung-soo, whom Imani had never trusted. If they decide to use her as leverage before the merger vote, Ji-hoon, it could be catastrophic. And if she's pregnant? A pause. A long, suffocating pause. "She's not pregnant," Ji-hoon had said. His voice was flat. Controlled. But Imani's hand had gone to her stomach. Because she was. She had found out 3 days earlier. She hadn't told him yet. She had been trying to find the right moment, the right words, trying to understand what it meant for two people who were still figuring out what they even were to each other. She stood in that hallway, hand pressed against a secret she hadn't spoken, listening to men discuss whether she was a liability. She didn't confront Ji-hoon that night. She smiled at dinner. She laughed at the right moments. She went home and sat in her dark apartment and thought about everything she had heard, and everything it meant. And then, 2 days later, came the visitor. She opened her door to find two men she didn't know, calm, well-dressed, with the particular stillness of people who had never once doubted their own power. One of them set a folder on her kitchen table. Inside were photographs. Of her. Of her mother's apartment. Of the non-profit where she worked. Of Imani herself, laughing, walking, living her ordinary life, all of it surveilled and catalogued like evidence. The Lee family's interests, the man said quietly, would be better served if your association with Chairman Park were to end. Permanently. And if I don't cooperate, she heard herself ask. He looked at the folder. He looked at her stomach, just for a fraction of a second, the barest flicker, and something in Imani's blood turned to ice. They knew. Or they suspected. And the message was clear without being spoken, it wasn't just her they were threatening. Think carefully, the man said. And they left. She sat alone for 3 hours. She thought about Ji-hoon, his laugh, his hands, the way he looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a room full of smoke. She thought about what it would mean to stay, to tell him, to let him try to protect them. He would. She knew he would try. He would go to war for them. He was exactly that kind of man. And that was why she couldn't let him. Because she had sat in that hallway and heard what his world already cost him. Because the Lee family controlled 3 seats on his board and had the kind of power that buried people quietly. Because her child, their child, was the most dangerous secret she now carried. She made herself stop crying at midnight. She packed what she could carry. She wrote a letter that she tore up 4 times before finally writing something she could live with, though she wasn't sure she could. And before the sun came up, Han Imani was gone. Ji-hoon had read the letter so many times the paper had softened at the folds. "I'm sorry. This isn't what I want. But it's what has to be. Please don't look for me. S." That was all. 11 words. No explanation. No accusation. Just, nothing. He hadn't slept for 4 days. His assistant had cancelled 3 meetings before Ji-hoon came back to himself enough to demand she reschedule them all. Oh Byung-soo had said it was for the best. Ji-hoon had thrown him out of his office and not spoken to him again for a year. He had looked for her. He'd hired people. The search had lasted 4 months before every lead went cold. It was as if she had dissolved into the city like rain into concrete, absorbed, invisible, gone. And then one day he stopped looking. Not because he stopped thinking about her, but because the thinking had become something unbearable that he'd had to wall off just to function. He'd buried it under work. Under acquisition targets and quarterly reports and the relentless forward motion that had made him who he was. He told himself he was angry. Betrayal was a cleaner wound than grief. He told himself a lot of things. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Incheon, Han Imani was learning what it meant to raise a child alone. Park Min-seo came into the world screaming, red-faced, and furious, and from the first moment she held her, Imani understood that every choice she had made was both completely worth it and completely devastating. She had Ji-hoon's jaw. She had Ji-hoon's eyes. She had, Imani would discover over the years, Ji-hoon's terrifying memory and his habit of staring at things with an intensity that felt like it could start fires. She found work where she could, waitressing, event staffing, eventually working her way into a steady position with a catering company that handled corporate and charity events across the city. It was hard. There were weeks when the math didn't quite work and she ate ramen so Min-seo could have proper meals. There were nights when her daughter was sick and she sat up alone, no one to call, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead and feeling the particular loneliness of a decision you can never take back. But Min-seo was luminous. She was funny and fierce and asked questions about everything. At 4, she'd informed her mother that clouds were sky water waiting to decide. At 5, she'd made friends with every stray cat in the neighborhood by leaving pieces of her lunch on the windowsill. She made Imani whole in ways she hadn't expected. She made the sacrifice real and livable and sometimes even something close to beautiful. She didn't let herself think about Ji-hoon. Mostly. She had learned, like Ji-hoon, to wall things off. The Park Star Foundation's annual Winter Gala was one of the most prestigious charity events in Korea. Imani's catering company had landed the contract for the 3rd year running, and the pay was good enough that she'd agreed to work the floor personally rather than just managing logistics. She arranged the childcare for Min-seo, ironed her uniform, and told herself it was just another event. She had not checked who the guest of honor was. She would later think about that, the casual, catastrophic oversight of not checking. The way fate apparently had no patience for people trying to move quietly through their lives. She was carrying a tray of champagne near the east side of the ballroom when she felt it, a shift in the room's atmosphere that she couldn't explain. A pulling sensation at the back of her neck, like a change in pressure before a storm. She looked toward the staircase. And the tray shook in her hands. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps just more solid, filled out into the kind of authority that changed the geometry of rooms. But his face was the same. The jaw she had traced with her fingers on 100 quiet mornings. The eyes that had once looked at her like she was someone worth being seen by. Those eyes were looking at her now. She didn't move. She couldn't. Beside her, Min-seo, whom she had brought when her childcare fell through at the last minute, who was supposed to stay in the back room, who was never supposed to be anywhere near this event, tugged at her hem. "Mommy," she said. "Why does that man keep looking at you?" The room seemed to tilt. She looked down at her daughter, this small, perfect person with her father's eyes, and understood, with a cold clarity that felt like falling, that whatever she had believed about her choices and her careful, hidden life was about to change completely. She looked back up at Ji-hoon. He had not moved. But something in his expression had, a crack in the stone, a fracture running through all that controlled, impenetrable stillness. She turned. She walked toward the service corridor. She walked fast, keeping her breathing even, keeping Min-seo's hand tight in hers. She didn't make it. "Imani." His voice behind her. Low. Not a question. Not an accusation. Just her name, spoken the way someone speaks a word they have been holding in their mouth for 7 years. She stopped. She turned slowly, because there was nothing else to do. He was standing 6 feet away in the empty corridor, his assistant hovering uncertainly at the far end. Up close, she could see what the distance hadn't shown, the tension in his jaw, the careful control of a man holding himself very still so he didn't shatter. Min Seo looked up at the tall man with frank, fearless curiosity. She tilted her head. She said nothing. Children often understood things before they had the words for them. "You're here," Ji-hoon said. His voice was very quiet. "Ji-hoon." 7 years, he said. 11 words. He swallowed. "Were you ever going to?" "Not here," she said. Her voice barely held. "Please. Not here." He looked at Min Seo. Min Seo looked back. And Ji-hoon went very, very still. Because he was looking at his own jaw. His own eyes. His own stubborn, searching expression, miniaturized, 6 years old, and wearing a little dress with a ribbon coming loose at the shoulder. "How old is she?" Ji-hoon said. It wasn't a question. Imani felt tears burn at the back of her throat. "Ji-hoon." "How old?" he said again, and his voice cracked on the second word, just barely. 6, she whispered. The silence between them was absolute. Min Seo, who had been watching the adults with the patient intensity of a child who has learned that grown-ups sometimes needed a moment, reached out and tugged the hem of Ji-hoon's jacket. Ji-hoon looked down, startled. "You have the same eyes as me," Min Seo said simply, with the devastating confidence of a 6-year-old stating a fact about the world. "Mommy says my eyes are special." Ji-hoon's composure broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just, a single sharp exhale, and the way his hand moved to the wall beside him like he needed something solid. "They are," he managed. "They are very special." An hour later, they sat in a quiet room off the main hall. Min Seo had fallen asleep on a small sofa, a catering napkin tucked under her head like a pillow. She slept the way young children sleep, completely, without reservation, as if the world were entirely trustworthy. Ji-hoon sat across from Imani at a small table. The sounds of the gala continued faintly through the walls, a different world, a world away. She told him everything. She told him about the men in her apartment. The folder. The photographs. The half-second glance at her stomach that had told her they either knew or suspected. She told him what she had understood, sitting alone in the dark, that he would fight for them, that his fighting might be exactly what put them in danger, that the only way to protect what mattered most was to make herself and their child simply cease to exist in his world. "I know you would have tried," she said. Her hands were folded on the table, very still. "I know you. You would have gone to war." "I would have won," he said. His voice was rough. "Maybe. But war has casualties, Ji-hoon." She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't willing to let our child be one of them." He was quiet for a long time. On the sofa, Min Seo shifted in her sleep and made a small sound. "I thought you left because of me," Ji-hoon finally said. "Something I did. Something about who I was." He paused. "I spent a long time being angry at you." "I know," she said softly. "I'm sorry for that part." "The Lee family," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. Something moved across his face, not anger, exactly. Something more complicated. Something that looked like 7 years of grief finally understanding its own shape. "They're gone," he said. "The merger fell through 6 years ago. 2 of the 3 board members retired. The family's influence over Park Star has been effectively zero for 4 years." She absorbed this. The cruelty of the timeline, how long ago the threat had dissolved without her knowing, while she continued to hide. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't." He looked at her. "You couldn't have known." Another silence. But different from the ones before it, not a silence full of damage, but one where 2 people were quietly setting down very heavy things. She asked me once, Imani said, her voice dropping, why she didn't have a father. She was 4. I told her that some families were shaped differently, and that our shape was perfect. She looked at Minasio sleeping. But she's asked again since. She's getting old enough to want more than an answer designed to protect her. Ji-hoon followed her gaze. He watched his daughter sleep, this child he hadn't known existed, this small person who had his eyes and his jaw and apparently, according to Imani, his habit of narrating her own thought process out loud while working through a problem. I want to know her, Ji-hoon said. His voice was very quiet. I want the chance to be her father. If you'll allow it. If she allows it. He paused. I'm not asking for anything from you beyond that. He stopped. Started again. She should know she has someone who would choose her. Every time. Without hesitation. Imani looked at him for a long moment. She already knows, she said quietly, that she is loved without limit. That part was always taken care of. Ji-hoon nodded. His jaw was tight. But yes, she said. You should know her. She paused. She's extraordinary, Ji-hoon. She's the most extraordinary thing I've ever been part of. I can see that, he said. And for the first time that night, something almost like a smile crossed his face, fragile and genuine and nothing like the polished expression he wore in boardrooms. She told me I had special eyes. Imani laughed despite herself, a small, startled sound that surprised them both. On the sofa, Minasio stirred. Her eyes opened slowly. She looked at the ceiling, then at her mother, then at Ji-hoon. She seemed to run some kind of internal calculation. Are you staying? She asked Ji-hoon. The directness of a child who has not yet learned to couch her most important questions. Ji-hoon looked at Imani. She looked back. 7 years of silence between them. 7 years of two people living in the shape that grief and sacrifice and love had carved them into. Yes, Ji-hoon said. His voice was steady now, the steadiest it had been all evening. I'm staying. Minasio considered this. Then she nodded once, apparently satisfied, and closed her eyes again. Outside, the charity gala continued. Crystal clinked. A diplomat made a toast. Somewhere in the crowd, people were still performing the beautiful, hollow rituals of a world built on surfaces. But in that small, quiet room, something true was beginning. It would not be simple. There would be conversations still to have, wounds still to tend, a child who deserved careful honesty about who her father was and why he had only just arrived. There would be questions, from the press, from the board, from the kind of people who had always watched Ji-hoon's life like it was entertainment. None of that was resolved yet. But in the space of one night, across the wreckage of 7 years, two people had found the thread they'd lost. And a girl with extraordinary eyes had pulled it tight just by asking the right question at the right moment. Sacrifice had separated them. But love, stubborn and patient and apparently immune to time, had refused to let go. It never does.